Well, the Ittihad, the original idea was for the ulama of the Ummah to have a union, an organization that's an umbrella for them.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alaikum salam.
We are here this morning with a distinguished scholar, Dr. Jasser Auda, who is a visiting professor at ISTAC, and he's also the president of the Maqasid Institute and board of trustees member of Ittihad. I'm Abdul Latif Ibrahim from International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, IAIS Malaysia, and this morning we'll be sharing our discussion. Our discussion will be on the Ittihad particularly, but of course we would also be talking about other issues affecting the Ummah, which I think Dr. Jasser is well versed in. So without much ado, I would like to ask, I'll start the ball rolling by asking Dr. Jasser, can you tell us something about the establishment of Ittihad, why it came about, what is the purpose of the organization, the nature, the character of Ittihad, and what are the objectives of Ittihad?
Inshallah. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, and good morning, Prof Latif, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I would like to thank IAIS for the kind invitation. My visits to IAIS over the years were always bringing very interesting discussions and made me think about so much of the ideas that I propose, and I go back and think and research and so on. So I hope that this discussion will also be useful to me as a researcher this way. Ittihad is the first word of the title of this organization, Al-Ittihad Al-Alami Li-Ulama Al-Muslimin, the International Union for Muslim Scholars. Oh. The International Union for Muslim Scholars is an idea that had started with our Ustad and Sheikh, rahimahullah, Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, back in the 90s of the previous century. And he tried to establish that union as an NGO, as a non-government organization in different countries in the Arab world. He actually tried to establish it in every country of the Arab League. And all the countries in the Arab League did not agree to register that. So he tried a few European countries, and he ended up registering it in Ireland as an NGO, as an Irish NGO, as International Union for Muslim Scholars, that was the name. And then eventually in 2012, a committee from the Ittihad, I was part of that committee, applied to the Qatari government to register the Ittihad in Qatar. Qatar does not have NGOs in its laws, but it was by a special decree for the Ittihad to have a status of a non-government organization, a special status. And therefore, the headquarters of the Ittihad moved from Dublin in Ireland to Doha. That was maybe about 12 years ago. So that's the establishment of the union as a history, as an organization. But the union has a number of offices full-time and so on in about a dozen countries. In Turkey and in Egypt and in other places, Tunis, etc. And there are scholars in the union from about 90 different countries around the world, east, west, north, south. So that's the establishment of the union and the organization.
Yeah, so how would you see the achievements of the Ittihad so far? What have they achieved so far?
Well, the Ittihad, the original idea was for the ulama of the Ummah to have a union, an organization that's an umbrella for them. You see, the ulama of Islam all over our history are divided into categories, if you wish. One category is what you could call the official ulama, the ulama that work for governments in different ministries, and the imams of the mosques, of the government-funded mosques, etc., and the muftis in the countries that have something called the Fatwa Council or Majlis Ifta or Dar al-Ifta or any. So there is a category of ulama that you could call rasmiyun, official, ulama, official.
Yes.
And they are ulama of the ummah, of course, those who are sincere. They are ulama of the ummah, and they serve Islam in their places in governments. But the idea was to create a body that is more of an NGO. It's for the ulama who are not official. The union is not represented by official ulama from different countries, like, for example, the Majma' al-Fiqh in Jeddah or the Majma' in Mecca or any of that. You find that every country sends their mufti or sends their representatives. The union is not composed of representatives of countries because it's not about that. It's about the non-official ulama that you could call ulama al-ummah, who work for the independent ulama. And the representation is from different madhabs. Madhahib al-ummah, all the madhabs that are considered, al-jama'ah, the general Ahl al-Qibla of Islam. The original idea is for all of these ulama to unite in one institution and for them to have a democratic process of electing a leadership and of issuing statements on important issues of the ummah, and as well to take initiatives, educational initiatives, research, fatwa, and so on, the different, of course, committees under the Ittihad. So that's the original vision. Since the establishment, some of this has been achieved, and there are many obstacles, obviously, especially because of the political scene and so on. But the Ittihad is not a political party and is not affiliated to any political group. It is a ulama body. Why would you create a ulama body? And there are government ulama bodies. Is why you have the same answer to why you have NGOs and you have government. Government has ministries that take care of the economics of the country, but there are NGOs that could work with issues of poverty, relief, issues of society. Yes, the government is responsible, but the NGOs are responsible too in a modern state.
You might say that this Ittihad is just like it's like a check and balance. It's like a check and balance for affairs affecting the ummah, which, despite being tackled by the official ulama, which you mentioned just now, ulama rasmiyun, but at the same time, you have a second opinion. You have some outside opinion on matters affecting the ummah. Is it something like that?
Yeah, of course, an independent opinion, and not just in terms of opinion, but also that takes initiatives. Educational initiatives and da'wah initiatives. And so forth, like trying to create parallel existence of the ulama voice. And that parallel existence is not initially against the official existence. It's not like that. It's not black and white. But it's like when you have, as I said, a relief organization or a masjid that is built by the population. Sometimes they build a masjid or a musalla or a surah that is not necessarily against the masjid of the wilaya or the city or the government, but it's a similar masjid, parallel masjid, and so on.
So you were mentioning about the leadership of the founder of this body, of course, the very esteemed scholar, Al-Marhum Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, and he was an institution in himself. I think the Muslim Ummah referred to him on many matters regarding fatwa, and he used to be giving, and he was an institution by himself. But since his passing recently, I mean, just 2 years back or so, he's been replaced by the current chairman, Sheikh Ali Karadagi. So, what do you see the direction of Ittihad under the new leadership of Sheikh Ali? Can you please describe?
Well, Sheikh Yusuf, rahimahullah, our Ustad and Sheikh, before he died, he nominated our Ustad as well, Professor Ahmed Al-Raisuni, to be the leader of the Ittihad. And Sheikh Al-Raisuni continued with the Ittihad for 3-4 years of his leadership, trying to establish educational institutes and trying to restructure the committees and so on, and have dialogue, etc. He worked on many projects, Sheikh Al-Raisuni. And it's well known that Sheikh Al-Raisuni had some comments related to Mauritania and Algeria and Morocco, etc. Some political comments that some members did not appreciate because they had a different political position. Was not the position of the Ittihad. Whether Sheikh Raisuni's position or the other position was not really the job of the Ittihad, but because of the members who did not like Sheikh Raisuni's comments on Mauritania and Algeria, the Sheikh resigned from his position. And the board, I'm a member of which, elected one of his vices, Sheikh Saqaf, from Indonesia, to replace him for a year or two until we had the elections again. In a couple of weeks back in Doha, we elected now Sheikh Ali Al-Qaradaghi as the new president. So basically, Sheikh Ali is the fourth president of the Ittihad, after Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, Sheikh Al-Raisuni, and Dr. Saqaf, and then Sheikh Ali Qaradaghi. Basically, the presidency is the symbol of the Ittihad, is the members of the General Assembly. The Ittihad has many members, tens of thousands, but about 1,000 of them gathered in Doha and elected Sheikh Ali. So he is a symbol of the Ittihad and the primary spokesperson of the Ittihad. The Ittihad, however, is an organization that has a number of committees and many offices and so on, that is doing the same work that we started from the initiation of the Ittihad in 2005. What Sheikh Ali Qaradaghi, our Ustad, Allah Yakrimu, has pledged is to do what he called mu'assasiyya, or to focus on the organizational work. In his pledge, when he was elected to the presidency, he said that he wants the work of the Ittihad to be more of an organizational work, and for every idea to become an organization that would really have its own impact. So basically, we're talking about an organization for da'wah, an organization for education, initiatives for dialogue, and so forth, to really work on how the Ittihad could become more of an organization and not, not revolving necessarily around the president. Of course, it revolved around our Ustad, Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, because as you mentioned, he was the Ustad of all of us, and he was, rahimahullah, an organization in its own right. Sheikh Qaradawi lived in Hijri 100 years, rahimahullah. In Common Era, he lived 96 years. And therefore, this long life of working for Islam and so on, by the time we elected him to the presidency of the Ittihad as the founding chairman, he came with his own thought and his own ideas and enemies and friends, etc. So the Ittihad was very much influenced by his character, rahimahullah. And he considered all of us to be projects. Like he would consider the scholars, the younger ones, his children age, like myself, to be projects that the Ittihad is means to helping them. Ittihad in its own right is not an objective, but it's an umbrella through which scholars could thrive, take responsibilities, etc. The responsibility that our Shaykh rahimahullah gave me at some point was the leadership of the Da'wah Committee, what's called the Da'wah Committee. So through the Da'wah Committee, I remember we did a lot of work in about 22 different countries, according to the report that we presented to him, eventually trying to make unions with Da'wah organizations and trying to find issues that of intellectual importance, like the translations of the Quran, where the gaps are, etc. Da'wah issues related to answering questions about Islam and what we call in Arabic shubuhat, or the tough questions, really, or people who have accusations against Islam. So under his leadership, we were doing, for example, myself, I was leading the Da'wah Committee. In one of the cycles, I led the Scholars Training Committee, Lajna Tadrib al-Ulama. So from in different countries around the world, we went and we tried to train the scholars on sensitive issues like Maqasid al-Sharia, like al-Wasatiyya, like the contemporary fatwa, fiqh al-aqalliyat in the minorities, and so forth. So the union was influenced by the Sheikh's ideas and the Sheikh's students. And now I believe we are moving towards a more systematic stage where it is not just the personality of the Sheikh, rahimahullah, and his students. We're all his students anyway. But it's more of trying to build organizations that have a lasting impact. And also one of the mandates that our Ustad Sheikh Ali Al-Qaradaghi has announced is to also go back to dialogue, especially with Muslim governments. Sheikh Qaradawi, during the time of what was called the Arab Spring, took a stance, not against the governments necessarily, but a stance with the people, that people are calling for justice, especially social justice, etc. So he supported the people, and we all know the scenes when he went to Tahrir Square and gave that khutbah with like a couple million people in the streets. So some governments considered the Sheikh and the Ittihad in general to be an enemy of them. And that is not true, because the Ittihad was never against governments in Muslim lands, but it is with the people if they go out in the streets and ask for justice and ask for rights. That happened back in the last decade in Syria and Sudan and Tunis, obviously, and Egypt, etc. Different countries, and Iraq and Yemen and everywhere. And so the Ittihad stood with the people, which caused the Ittihad a problem with some of the governments. But our mandate now is to go back to dialogue, to try to open dialogue with the different governments in the Muslim world in general, and especially in the Arab world, so that the Ittihad could have a role that is its mandate, the role of an independent ulama voice that builds, that is not necessarily against the current political systems, but is trying to reform and is trying to advise on issues like the current issues and so on.
Yeah. So you were talking about the direction. I mean, what is being done by Ittihad is perhaps it's a pioneering effort in scholarship. For example, the concept of Maqasid and also Wasatiyah, and you have set up Maqasid Institutes in many places, I think. But this is something perhaps which is quite new in the context of the Islamic movement or the Islamic thought. It still has got something, especially when you find that there are, for example, the other ulama, which you didn't categorize just now. Let's say the traditional conservative ulama, not the progressive, the inclusive types, who can accept the Maqasid framework. So, do you see this as a challenge to the work of Ittihad? How are you going to overcome this? Because I think at the Ummah level, I mean, of course you have social media now. It's a globalized world. You can reach information everywhere. But then the problem is, the conflict with those ulama may be, it could be that they would not be so happy with the development of Maqasid or Wasatiyah.
Yeah.
Can you explain?
Well, that's normal. That's normal that voices of renewal in our ummah has its naysayers and people who are against the renewal. It's not just Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi and Wasatiyah. Imam Abu Hanifa had his enemies. Imam Shafi'i was accused of bid'ah. Imam Ahmad and Imam Malik and so forth, and Ahl al-Bayt obviously. And like every time there is an Imam who brings new ideas to Islam, like Imam Shafi'i in his Risala, and he tried to bridge the gap between the two conflicting parties at this time, if you read the book Al-Risala or the Message. And people accused him of all sorts of things. So it's normal that Sheikh Qaradawi, when he started the movement of Al-Wasatiyah, and he and a number of other scholars really in his time, that would be around the middle of the previous century, really, some 70, 80 years back now, as a movement that defined the thought of the Islamic movements in general. So he was part of the Muslim Brotherhood in his youth, and then he became independent from them. But the thought of the Muslim Brotherhood is more of the Wasati thought. Not only that, but for example, some of the universities in India and the approach they take, Nadwat al-Ulama, for example, the relationship between Sheikh Yusuf and Sheikh Abul Hassan Nadwi was very strong, and Nadwat al-Ulama also took a Wasati school. We have Wasati voices all over that joined the Ittihad from Africa, North and South, from Asia, different countries, minorities and majorities. We have people who affiliate themselves to the Wasati schools in Europe and North and South America. And the Ittihad, by the way, has individual memberships and has organizational memberships. So we have thousands of individuals and also thousands of organizations that join the Ittihad. But also there are people who do not affiliate themselves to the Wasati school. And in the last decades of Sheikh Yusuf's life, rahimahullah, he and a number of other scholars, some of them are well known in Malaysia, like the scholars who were behind the International Institute, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, and eventually IAIM, the International University of Malaysia, like Sheikh Taha Al-Alwani, who was part of this initiative, and others, Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, rahimahumullah jami'an. They were part of the Wasati school.
Professor Ismail Faruqi, was he?
Professor Ismail Faruqi was also part of the Wasati stream. You can classify him this way. Of course, Islamization of knowledge is a particular project. There is the Maqasid project as a particular project. There are people who talk about integration, not Islamization. People who are talk about renewal, not or reform. These are projects that are all, I would classify as part of the Wasati general stream. And of course, you mentioned traditional. I don't classify necessarily scholars into progressive and others. Progressive idea is not really an Islamic categorization, but the traditionalists, people who prefer to follow the madhahib, and like to stick to one madhab and not. Some of these scholars are in the union, actually. There are scholars in the union of Muslim scholars who participate only as Maliki or Shafi'i, or there are scholars who are like that, many of them actually. And there are others who have a wider scope, closer to our Shaykh rahimahullah, that pick from the different madhabs, what he called al-ijtihad al-intiqa'i, the selective ijtihad. He selects from the different madhab. And when he used to be asked, what is your madhab? He would say, I'm Hanafi, I'm Shafi'i, I'm Hanbali. You can call me Hanafsha'i. So he would just make an Arabic word to whatever, like he wasn't really going by that classification. Is it a challenge? I don't think it is, because the Ummah is always mutanawwi'a. The Ummah is always diverse.
Yeah.
Like we always have the Shafi'is and the Hanafis and the Mu'tazilis. And Sheikh Yusuf actually used to say that and used to write that that the Ummah of Islam is much bigger than any school. He would call it حرفية ابن حزم واعتزالية القاضي عبد الجبار and so forth, like the Imam Maliks of the Ummah and the Qadi Abdul Jabbar, the Mu'tazili, and the Jahid, and so on, and Ja'far al-Sadiq, and this is all part of the Ummah. And that is the approach of the Ittihad, that it's a unifying place and not a dividing place. Some people do not like the unification. That is up to them. But it's not really a challenge. I think the challenge is for those who do not wish for independent scholars to have a voice. And that is the major challenge. Because some governments and some scholars do not want an independent scholar to voice an opinion or give a fatwa or write a book without necessarily the approval of the madhab or the university or a government body. And that's not everybody. Some governments are very open to hearing scholars and to give them space. So
talking about that, but before we come to other issues, a bit sensitive perhaps. Where do you get your funding to operate, and how do you finance yourself? Because you were giving us a list of activities that you were doing. So this, of course, is costly, especially you have the ulama having to travel and so many other things to do. So how do you manage?
Yeah, well, no, it's not a sensitive question. Actually, it's a very important question, and thank you for asking it. The Ittihad has a number of sources of income, primary of which is the membership of its scholars.
You mean scholars
there are membership fees? Yeah,
I see.
There are membership fees. They're different between different countries depending on their economy. But an average membership fees is about $100 American every year. And you have a couple thousand scholars who are active members, but the affiliated members of the Ittihad are close to 100,000. And therefore,
100,000 other scholars,
members, affiliated through their organization.
Do they have to pay?
The organization pays. So there are organizations fees and there are individual fees. So the income, number one, of the Ittihad is the membership fees. The second income is donations that the Ittihad receives, especially for particular projects. Like, for example, when we have the da'wah activities that I mentioned, there were da'wah organizations that have their own sources of funds that supported us in holding these activities. And when we had a meeting in Turkey for the whole committee and planning and so on, there was a hosting by one of the municipalities in Istanbul. They hosted us for a few days. And when we had the meeting recently in Doha, we were hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we applied to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar to host a meeting.
So you are based in Qatar, but then does the Qatari government itself...
No, the Qatari government has no relation with the Ittihad in terms of funding. But the Qatari government, Jazakallah Khair, made a waqf. So a waqf for the Ittihad many years back during Sheikh Yusuf's time, that was a piece of land. And then eventually the financial committee dealt with a number of business people, and there was an apartment building built on that. The renting of that building gives some funding to the Ittihad. But Qatar is not the only country that did that. We had a similar waqf in Sudan, given by the government.
Financials might be covered by waqf.
By the awqaf, And we have a project called Waqful Ittihad that we have been fundraising for it for many years. But we haven't, so that is also part. At some point, we had an office in Egypt, and there was Egyptian organizations, official and non-official, that also funded us. We have, of course, as I mentioned, not the Turkish government itself, but municipalities in Istanbul or in other cities in Turkey. They host us some of our activities through their awqaf. The awqaf, and of course, a place like Turkey has a number of awqaf. In Tunis, we had a research center, now closed with the new changes in the government, and the head of the union in Tunis, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, of course, is in prison now over these allegations. But Sheikh Rashid at that time did not receive anything from the government, but it was from different NGOs that were interested in funding the research.
Okay.
And the publication that we did through Tunis was also in collaboration with some publishers, like book publishers. At some point, there was collaboration with Furqan Foundation in London. I was one of its directors at some point, which was part of Yemeni Foundation. So foundations, NGOs, funding parts of the Ittihad, publishing some of its books, covering expenses when the ulama meet. But the Ittihad until today is actually keeping its mandate that it's an independent organization and does not accept direct funding from governments. It's only for events.
That is to preserve the independent identity of the organization.
Exactly, the independent, the nature of it. It's an NGO. It's not really. So an NGO could take a grant from the government for a project or a conference, but an NGO is not under government. Like, this is not how it works. And the headquarters was in Dublin. Of course, we didn't receive anything from the Irish government or any of that, except for, as an NGO, you have, your tax, exemptions, etc. in Europe. And in Doha now, it's the same thing. And there is an office in Turkey that also has its own waqf.
You have any in Malaysia?
There is an office in Malaysia. There is an office in Malaysia, and it is headed by Dr. Wan Subki. Here, he is from Kelantan. Okay. And Dr. Wan is actually elected back to the board a couple of weeks back when we had our elections in Doha. Okay. He was elected by the popular vote of the scholars. So he is in the new board, and he is heading our office in Malaysia.
In Malaysia. That's good, interesting. Okay, I'll now maybe go to outside of Ittihad, what you have described as the work that you do, looking at the condition of the Ummah, especially with conflict zones, and you know how the situation is like, especially right now. Of course, the most important issue affecting the Ummah is Palestine. So, what role does Ittihad play in the context of issues affecting Muslims, especially in Palestine, in Kashmir, in minorities and other minorities somewhere in certain parts of the world? So is there any action from Ittihad to address these very burning issues which need some kind of... I'll take an example. Is there anything like, because scholars are some of the world-renowned scholars are under the umbrella of Ittihad. Okay, they come up with fatwa. Okay, we find that there are certain practices among the Muslims in the context of they're quite traditional. Like for example. Pilgrimage to Mecca, to perform Hajj and Umrah. Let's take Umrah for example. For Umrah, we find that people sometimes they go every year for Umrah. It's a costly affair, these days to go for an Umrah, but perhaps they can afford it. And I'm not trying to say that it is not to be, but can there be some kind of, let's say, rethinking in the fatwa or something from the ulama, so as to channel funds to the Palestinians, for example, who are now suffering, and especially with the war now going on, and you can see that the displacement of 2 million over Palestinians in Gaza, and the destruction, and Gaza is now wasteland. It's been made into a wasteland by the regime, the Zionist regime. And how to rebuild and to bring back the life to the suffering Palestinians would need a lot of money. It just cannot come from the governments alone. I think the Ummah should also come in. And you would have heard of the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestine, which has been now it's not getting its funds from the main donors. So there's a shortfall in that as well. So do you think something can be done by Ittihad to address this problem?
Yeah, of course, of course. The mandate of the Ittihad is voicing opinions, giving fatwas, giving the Islamic perspective on things. The mandate of the Ittihad is not political in the sense that the Ittihad itself is not a political organization. It doesn't govern budgets or ministries, or it doesn't have armies. It doesn't have a relationship with political parties anywhere. This is not what the Ittihad is doing. And therefore, the Ittihad, as a body of scholars, has to sound the opinion, the Islamic opinion.
Yeah.
In all of these issues, the Ittihad actually did give these opinions. The Ittihad issued a number of fatwas mentioning Umrah. Yeah, one of them was related to whether it is better to do Umrah or to give money for what's happening in Palestine, for the relief organizations, etc. And the Ittihad gave the fatwa that the money should go to the relief organizations. In fact, the Ittihad had deliberations about Hajj itself, but then eventually the scholars decided that no, Hajj is a farida, is necessary. People have to go to Hajj, especially if they have not done Hajj before.
Yes, not done.
But if they have done Hajj, or if it is Umrah, and therefore it is nafil, it is not the required hukum, it is a recommendation or optional, then it is better that you relieve your brothers and sisters in Palestine. So the Ittihad gives these opinions. The Ittihad supported the resistance movement in Palestine because we are talking about an occupied land, and this costed Sheikh Qaradawi rahimahullah at that time fatwas against his life from some of the extreme groups in the occupied land and so forth. And it costs the scholars of the Ittihad also similar attacks and threats because of their opinion supporting the resistance. So this is basically what the Ittihad could offer, trying to relieve the blockade that is happening. So the Ittihad gave a number of statements and fatwas that it is haram, it is a kabira, it is a major sin to block the relief from our brothers and sisters in Gaza, or to participate in the attacking army and so forth. It is a major sin, and some of the scholars of the Ittihad gave opinions that it even amounts to ridda or apostasy. The Ittihad officially did not give the ridda kind of fatwa, officially said it's a major sin, but many individual scholars from the leadership of the Ittihad mentioned that there is a great danger for Muslims who support the enemies, that they could be outside the circle of Islam, and so forth. So basically, yes, we need a lot of effort, but we need also to ask from the scholars as much as they can do. They are just scholars of Islam, especially they are non-official. They don't have power, basically, except for the power of the truth and the power of saying the truth. Alhamdulillah, the International Union for Muslim Scholars all over its years have been saying the truth on these issues. We made statements and sent messages and even asked for boycotting and so on during the oppression of our brothers and sisters in China. We took a similar position on Kashmir, a similar position, you name it, on Yemen, on
Rohingya.
Obviously Syria, Rohingya, different parts, whether in the Arab world or outside in Africa. So we take the right positions on these things, but it takes more than that for our ummah to be able to defend itself. It takes political effort is very important. Governments have to come together. The Union called for the Muslim governments to unite forces and unite economies and unite their will. Many of the governments are actually taking a very clear stance on the issue in Palestine, since I'm in Malaysia, I have to really greet the government, Jazakumullah khairan, for the stance it's taking. It's a principled stance.
Yes.
And it's rare. Nobody takes that stance that strong. Alhamdulillah. But you cannot do everything by yourself. There has to be union and there has to be collaboration. You cannot just as one government change the status quo. And the Ittihad has been calling for that union amongst Muslims. It doesn't mean that we are not different countries. We could be different countries, different provinces, different administrations, but there has to be unions and collaboration amongst Muslims. Muslims cannot be divided that much to the extent of fighting against each other.
Yeah.
The Ittihad always stood against internal fighting in the Muslim Ummah. I mentioned the issue of North Africa, between our brothers in the different countries there, Morocco and Algeria, etc. The Ittihad, the official position is always calling for unity and calling for avoiding the border conflicts and so on.
Yeah.
So that's the position.
That's an Islamic injunction to
exactly.
unite brothers who are in conflict. Yes,
exactly.
Yes. Let me come to perhaps the last one. On the issue of Palestine, you would have noticed that it is not unfortunate. It's a good thing that South Africa brought the case, the ICJ case of genocide against Israel at the International Court of Justice. No Muslim country did that. So, what is the position of Ittihad has in this context? And I think there may be other countries which may even bring it to the other court, ICC, International Criminal Court, to try the leaders of the regime for genocide and war against crimes against humanity. So I think what would be your position? I taking up this. I have not read anything about Ittihad having a position on the ICJ and other international action taken by countries to against Israel. So
no, the Ittihad issued a statement, and the president of the Ittihad, Sheikh Ali Al-Qaradaghi, took the statement to the embassy of South Africa in Qatar and put it on social media. Problem is that social media doesn't allow things that are anti-Zionist to spread too much. That's another problem. But if you go to the official website of the Ittihad, there is a statement on South Africa greeting them for the position they took on ICJ and saying that this is a very important revealing kind of statement that they made, especially the accusation that they took in the official statements of the lawyers. So the Ittihad greeted that, and also the Ittihad noted that the whole system is flawed. So it is not that we rely necessarily on the international system, even though it is important to greet any call for justice or any attempt to bring some balance politically or economically and so on. But the whole system needs some deep changes, really, because the whole system is proving ineffective. The international community came together and formed the League at the beginning and then the UN and so on to achieve certain objectives. And it's obvious that because of the pressure of the current situation, it is becoming clear, East and West, that the system is not functioning and that the international order is not genuine. And that people who talk about human rights and freedoms and so forth are not really authentic in their calling for this, because it's very obvious. It's very obvious. I'm from Canada. The average Canadian person now knows that this is not true. This apparatus of human rights and so on. And that is very dangerous, I know.
Yes.
But this is basically, even the average person, not just Muslims, the average neighbors that we have in Canada, for example, know that the game is obviously corrupt, and that our government, who is supposed to be standing with human rights and standing with peace and all the history that Canada has, is not taking the same position on what's happening in Gaza, similar to what was happening in Ukraine, for example, because the system is flawed. And that is also part of what the Union has voiced. So yes, of course, encourage South Africa and also encourage the Arab governments and Muslim governments in general. The statement says that in its title, encouraging Arab and Muslim governments to follow suit and go to the international bodies of justice and so on, but also to recognize that there is a deep flaw in the international system that allowed the killing of these tens of thousands of innocent people. The bigger number, I guess, is in the hundreds of thousands. It's not just, so it's a major massacre that we are watching live on TV. That there is a problem here that we need to address. And the Ittihad, as I mentioned, doesn't have armies, doesn't have political power or any of that. The Ittihad is a group of scholars who issued statements and called for a change of that status.
That's very good on the part. I mean, at least the important thing is for Ittihad, although it is known as a union of scholars, ulama, but they are always up to date with current issues affecting the ummah, and especially political issues, socio-economic issues. So, because this is very important in the context of the development of the ummah. So, with that, I think we have come to the end of the podcast, the show, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof.
For all the information. That it's very important that the ulama take a very active role in the affairs of the ummah, because the ummah have a special space in their hearts for the ulama as the guide for the progress and whatever you have. And if they take a strong stand on issues affecting the ummah and don't waver, and as you mentioned, you're an independent organization, and that makes it even more. So we hope the best for Ittihad in the coming years. And,
thank you, sir. Jazakallah khair.
And it will help the ummah to move forward.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much.
Barakallahu
Assalamu alaikum
feekum.
wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.